又能做到。
To talk more about Mandela's legacy, we are joined by Shadrach Guto, a professor at the Institute for African Renaissance Studies at the University of South Africa in Johannesburg. And from London, we have Ayo Johnson, editor of Viewpoint Africa. And here in Beijing, Professor He Wenping, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, with us. Welcome to our program. What do you think? At the end of the day, Nelson Mandela managed to win both the hearts and minds of so many around the world. Why did that happen? How did that happen? Mr. Johnson.
It's because Mr. Mandela lived a selfless life. He wasn't selfish. He gave so much. He asked for so little in return. He pushed ahead with the ANC movement, which galvanized people's hearts and minds around the world, irrespective of the fact that they were fighting against a very racist apartheid movement that was very, very robust, strong, and they used all the machinery at their disposal to quash down the ANC. And besides, as a result of that, Mandela won the hearts and minds around the world, and he became the father of the nation of South Africa. He became an ambassador for the entire African continent and the global icon which we've come to know him for. So it's because of those goodwills. He always said, look forward, not backwards. He wouldn't, he said he will forgive. He said he will forget. And he understood that South Africa was only going to be prosperous, only going to be successful if it was both white and black collectively working towards that objective.
I'm sure, Mr. Guto, South Africans in South Africa and around the world are extremely proud of Mr. Mandela. However, on the other hand, some say he is the last statesman standing in today's politics. With his pass away, probably we wouldn't find politicians of his manner and of his legend anymore in the future. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that is quite true. We have to say, to have a leader who becomes head of state in Africa and the rest of the world really saying, I have 2 terms to serve the nation, but I'm only going to do it 1 term, and I will hand over the baton to younger leaders to be able to take this forward. It is unprecedented in many ways. I think that shows what kind of leader he was. For me, however, there are 3 levels at which I remember Mandela. First of all, I had the privilege to shake his hand, and I feel the warmth of that. And he wrote a foreword to one of my books. I worked together with his eldest daughter, Maki, and I taught some of the grandchildren. And I know people like Winnie personally, Gracia Machel, and so on. So that is one. The second one is really one where we are talking about a leader. And he was a leader who allowed those who are working under his government really to do the best they could. It wasn't a leader trying to muscle the various ministers under him. And the ministers became very productive and innovative and free to be able to experiment. And I think that was something great. Yeah.
But on the other hand, Mr. Guto, some have also argued that Mr. Mandela could well interfere in certain ways into the current administration and previous administration inside South Africa, so politics wouldn't go that sour inside your country. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that we are dealing with evolution, and change always occur in a system. He was the symbol of national unity, and if you like, people talk about questions of, you know, bringing people together who are different. But I believe that the test that we really face now is not whether a leader projects that we need to create a society of unity, and for society to do it. So economically, South Africa is still very divided, and we have a situation of peaceful coexistence rather than national proper cohesion. So that comes about. The other is one of, he was And he needed to do that to put the country together. It's for the leaders who took over from him to be able to say, how do we navigate this journey forward? And I think that's where we have a lot of problems. His administration, corruption was very low, nepotism was low.
We're going to go into some of the details.
Now we have all of those problems.
We are going to into some of the details of challenges that South Africa still faces today. But Ms. He, another interesting issue to many of us here in China related to the legend of Mr. Mandela is that he was fascinated about Chinese Revolution. He was fascinated about the tactics Chairman Mao used during the Chinese Revolution. He was fascinated about the book Red Star Over China, written by Edgar Snow, talking about how the Chinese communists get away from the Chinese nationalists. He was also very fascinated about communism during his time. What do you think, though, has made him to change his mind and eventually have an economy that is very much featuring market economy, very much featuring more like a Western-style democracy after the apartheid was being wiped out?
I think the reason for his change is due to the reality in South Africa. You know, the South Africa has a quite different situation with that in China. And I think those spirits he got from the China's revolution process. For example, he mentioned there was a long march story led by the Chinese Communist Party during the year 1930s, and also all those struggles Chinese Communist Party had done. So this is a spirit taking. So those spirit, you know, for him and also for his colleagues has been put into prison, and also other ANC comrades and soldiers outside of those prisons. So they can got a lot of experiences from those Chinese experiences. So that's why he said he even celebrated the Chinese National Day when he was in prison. But eventually, I think Mandela himself is a nationalist. He made this quite clear in his memoir. He said because he was taught when he was a son of a chief, and he learned all those books and all those like even those Marxism books. You know, those books, situation, he had to fit into the reality in Africa, because all those struggles with anti-apartheid movement, they had to united with not only South African Communist Party and also with that Pan-Africanist movement, and also the blacks, you know, consciousness movement. Those are the movements organized by the South African youth, black youth. So all of them, they have different ideology.
Right.
Not only those communist ideology, that maybe they have like from those black, those traditional ideology or some other religious movement. So all of them. So they have to unite all those movements with a single slogan, that is the African nationalism.
And Mr. Johnson, after said all of these, which is in a way some of the interesting aspect of Mr. Mandela's life, do you think other African leaders on the African continent these days can learn from the examples of Mr. Mandela? Are they willing to learn, or are circumstances provide them with the opportunities to learn? Mr. Johnson, briefly.
Learn they will have to. In fact, in South Africa specifically, Thabo Mbeki, Motlanthe, and of course Zuma, who is the president currently, have all sought his counsel. They've all sought his experience, his guidance, and even when Mandela was ill, he was frail, and in fact, most recently, pictures were being taken which reflect a South African president who needed reassurances from the man himself to give comfort to the population at large. Internationally, across the entire African continent, all African leaders are looking at the Mandela model to see how far they can learn from that. Why are they not been able to stand up in his shoes, which is so big and so wide? So a lot of them would have to learn from the experience of Mandela in the hope that they can translate those good practices in their own respective countries. I believe that as time will go on, the Mandela model will become the blueprint by which African leaders would emulate and hopefully aspire to. But as to whether they can actually be exactly like him,
can they be adopted? Can they be learned immediately by the others? For example, the current South African administration, Mr. Guto, I'm sure you have a better judgment than any of us here. So what do you think? the pass away of Mr. Mandela mean for the internal politics inside South Africa, which I think now is pretty much challenged by many of the issues you mentioned earlier: corruption, economy, growth rate slowing down, crimes, anger, frustrations, wealth gap, all of these. What do you think the politicians can do or can learn from the example?
Well, I believe very strongly that Mandela was important at the moment that he led the country. It was a difficult moment. He set the foundations, but we have been seeing really the growth of neoliberal economic approach to development in South Africa. We are seeing quite a lot of growth of corruption, nepotism, and so on. Those needs to be dealt with, and I believe that the new leaders ought to say, what do we, the best that we pick out of his leadership, and try to build an economy where the majority feel they have a stake in the growth of their country, not simply to say South Africa is a middle-income country, is part of BRICS and so on, but are the people part of that, or are the majority being left out? Because that's a crisis for the future
Do you
to
think?
come.
Do you think the African National Congress is likely to reform itself from the current administration in order to handle some of the issues that you just mentioned? Is it possible?
No. Yeah, I think that the African National Congress, the leaders within it, ought to stand back and look at where South Africa has come in the last 20 years.
All right.
And to be able to say, what do we need to do differently from what has been there before?
They ought to, but will they?
Unless they do that.
Okay, they ought to, but will they do that, Mr. Johnson?
Well, I believe they will. I think they have no other choice. The poverty levels are slightly high. Unemployment is our major problem. And the people need access to healthcare, education. And in places like Soweto, things are very, very dire. So I think the people will demand, as they are doing currently, that their leaders, especially in Zuma, does that much more. And of course, curbing the element of corruption, which is a problem which is synonymous across Africa. I think and I believe the ANC model will work. They have momentum on their side. They have Mandela's legacy to support them. And above all, they are already a superpower on the African continent itself. South Africa's GDP growth is nearly 1/5 of the entire African continent. It's developing very, very fast, and I think that development will continue, and hopefully we may see a trickle down where the middle class, which is crucial, will continue rising and increasing in numbers.
Hopefully. That is an interesting word coming from you. But Ms. He, here in Beijing, we understand the African National Congress, in fact, as a party, has won its charm because of Nelson Mandela, this legendary figure, and he has remained there for the party over the past few decades. And with his passed away, will this specific political party lose its charm among the public? And if they were at least a certain degree of it, what does it mean for the political scene inside South Africa?
Well, I think even though the ANC, the ruling party, has facing the daunting challenges ahead, for example, the next year, 2015, will be the fifth presidential election in the newborn democratic South Africa. So ANC now, according to a lot of observations, the supporting vote for the ANC maybe will decline, but not so much. Maybe probably from the previous election that was 65% supporting rate, maybe we are coming down a little bit, like less than 60%, but we are above 56%, I'm sure. So that also will lead to the ANC continue to be a dominant party in the political arena. So the challenge is how to resolve those economic issues. Like my colleagues from London mentioned, that is the very high unemployment rate, especially for those angry black youth. That is also why, this youth leader is called Malema. Now he has been kicked out from the ANC, but he's still very influential figure among those black youth. So that maybe will cause quite I think, a serious challenge for this dominant role given by the ANC for the past 2 decades.
And before we go, one of the very important issues now is how we remember that man, the man that carries history on his shoulder. We understand there's going to be funerals being held inside South Africa. People are mourning Mr. Mandela all over the world, but there are quite a number of reports about certain people in his circle trying to get the brand of Mandela. That was also quite a tug of war. So many want to know how the legend of Mr. Mandela is going to be carried out. Will it be carried out in the national spirit, or will it be carried out in a tug of war just to get the brand? Mr. Guto, I want to have your very brief analysis about this first.
Well, time and space is very important in analyzing any situation. Mandela had his time. He provided strong leadership. He was able to steer the country away from conflict into trying to find a new path of national cohesion. The question is, the other leaders coming now, we are dealing with the situation in South Africa now where multi-party democracy is becoming a reality, and which he didn't face very much at the beginning. That is a new phenomenon. How do you manage that?
All right.
We are dealing with situations which have been mentioned of high unemployment, lack of...
I got your point.
Really,
And Mr. Johnson, your last word.
I believe the situation in South Africa would improve. The challenges are there. I believe the leaders will have to step up their game. Ultimately, if they don't, the next elections we would see newer parties gain ground. But I think ultimately the ANC would be here to stay in the medium to long term. They're a party that has started this movement, and people will not forget that.
Ms. He, final words.
I think the ANC, even though they are facing challenges, but they are continue. They will do very good for the country, and also there's no other way for them to overcome those challenges. But Mandela's legacy will be a fortune for the ANC rather than a burden.
And of course, also a fortune for the rest of the world. Thank you very much, He Wenping, Ayo Johnson, and Shadrach Guto. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you. And we have got plenty more ahead here on World Insight on CCTV News, including a debate on Joe Biden's trip to Asia. So stay tuned.
Still to come, caught in the middle. Joe Biden faces a difficult balancing act as he navigates a heated dispute between China and Japan. And Ukraine on edge. Protests continue in Kiev as the nation is torn between East and West.
New shipping hub in Northeast Asia. Reaching the world from Northeast.